I'd just like to say welcome to everyone on behalf of the Centre for Black Theology, Regent's Park College. I'm Carol, Research Associate of the Centre and the Reviews Editor of the Black Theology Journal. Also here in the background doing the technical stuff is Professor Anthony Reddy, Director of the Centre and Editor of the Journal. So I just wanted to give a brief kind of context to the event while people are still coming in. So over the past few years, even before we were an official centre, it's been our privilege to be in touch with various Black scholars at different stages of work in the area of theology or religion. We had those who were considering pursuing further theological study, or others already on that path, and also those who had already attained their PhDs and were developing careers both within and outside of the Theological Academy. It's been great to hear people's stories and to provide a space for the sharing of experience, ideas, information, advice, and encouragement. The three scholars we're celebrating today were part of that ongoing conversation and interaction. We realised how unusual and significant it was to have three Black women theologians in the British context publish books around the same time. 27 years ago, when the Black Theology Journal started, no Black woman in the British context had sole authored an academic book on theology. So this occurrence, where there are three, is a special moment. Hence why we wanted to celebrate that by bringing them together to talk about their work. We have Dr. Selina Stone, for whom this is her third book. Dr. Elisa Louis, for whom this is her second book, but her first self-authored. And those are both with SCM. And Dr. Victoria Omotoso, for whom this is her first book. So the outline of the evening is the authors will speak in the order their books were published, and they will each speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. At the end of that, they'll have a discussion for 10, 15 minutes or so between themselves, and then we'll open up the Q&A to the audience. So I hope that's okay for everyone. So would Selina like to start the discussion?
Sure. Thank you so much, Carol, for hosting us today, and Anthony for organising this event. It really is a real privilege to be on a panel with these two brilliant women, and I'm more excited to hear them talk about their work than I am to talk about my own. It really is a joy for me to see their work published and to see us thriving in this way. I'm going to speak a little bit about the new book that I've written, and also about my process of writing and my approach to the book. And I'll also read a little bit of it as well, just to give you a taste of what I have been working on. And I'm going to set a little time for myself so I can be on time. So why this book? So, I mean, it's probably worth saying that in terms of this being my third book, I early on agreed with myself that I would write probably two sets of things. One set that were focusing on the academy, and another set of books that are written for people, because a lot of the time we are encouraged and rewarded in our higher education sector for writing the kinds of books that other academics find useful. And sometimes those kind of books are very unhelpful if you're just a normal person who wants to read books about faith and life and theology. And so I agreed with myself, because I think I have a slight addiction to writing, that I would write two sets of things. And that is not anything that anybody should do, to be fair, but I really enjoy it, and so it works for me. So this is the second book I've written that I've written with people in mind. I could say with the church in mind, because a lot of these questions are about what's happening in our congregations, what's happening for people who actually are Christians and have faith and are trying to live this faith out. And I feel very much in my work to be led by those questions. And this is, I think, very much what it is to be a theologian. I think I'm interested in what the other doctors will say about their path towards this work. But for me, it's come out of my sense of calling and to community, not just my own personal advancement. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is often with my community in mind and in my heart as I'm thinking about what the challenges that we're facing. So the issue of spiritual abuse then is something that we've been hearing more and more about. And something that frankly just drives me crazy that this keeps happening. And so part of what drove me to write this book was a sense of urgency that we kept on seeing this pattern of abusive leaders in leading churches and doing considerable harm to lots of people in lots of places. And there were lots of books being written on this. I shouldn't say that. There were some books being written on the topic. Some of them were being written and they focused on the problem of narcissism in the church, for example, narcissistic personalities, or they thought about, bullies in the pulpit or toxic church cultures and all of these really important dynamics to what causes us to end up with abuse happening in religious contexts. But what I kept seeing when I was looking at these books, and I was reading them really out of my own personal interest, was people would hint at the fact that theology was a problem. So even when psychologists wrote books, and Professor Lisa Oakley has led a lot of the work in the UK on spiritual abuse, she would talk about theology is a problem. And in her encounter with survivors and victims who would tell their stories, they would also always talk about the preaching that was happening or the kind of ideas that were circulating in their congregation and how it contributed to the perfect storm that led to this preacher or pastor being able to groom people, harm people in a myriad of ways. And so I started to think, well, if we've kind of addressed the problem of individual personalities and we've thought about toxic cultures in the church and we've talked about safeguarding policies and we've had to think about governance structures, the thing that nobody's really doing is thinking about doctrine and teachings by the church, the ideas that circulate in preaching every week and how this might be playing a role in grooming people, in putting people in even more of a vulnerable position when it comes to abusive individuals. And that might be the person in the pulpit, the person in charge, but it might be someone who you sit by in church every week. So there are so we needed to deal with the theology. And so as I was hearing these stories and I was kind of spotting some of the threads that I thought, as somebody who loves thinking about theology and the ideas we have about God, I felt it was partly my responsibility as a theologian, as an ethicist, to actually begin to do that work. Because the psychologists were thinking about, the psychological harm being done to people, and the church leaders were thinking about better governance structures. But as a theologian, I thought the thing I could contribute is thinking about the theology and the way that theology is shaping our expectations, the dynamics of power within our churches. And so that's why I wrote the book, was to make a theological contribution to a field of work that was already being written, but from the perspective of different disciplines. So I wanted to write as a theologian, really. And my approach to this was really rooted in something I read after the fact. So I've been reading about a lot of things of theology and ethics at the moment, and I read this really interesting line by James Cone in God of the Oppressed, where he says that all ethical problems are theological problems. And I realised that I have written this book from that perspective before I read him write this, because I think that when we think about these questions of abuse of power, we actually need to be mindful of how these ethical problems, the problems in the ways that we're living with one another, problems often in the sense of morality that we see or don't see within our churches, often have theological roots. And so I wanted to really think deeply about that. What are the theological roots and the foundations of this spiritual abuse crisis? And some of these ideas were already being named by the psychologists, victim survivors in their own accounts. So the ideas of sacrifice being good, right, without any sense of boundaries, suffering being necessary for the Christian life. Not necessarily always going to the point of abuse, but actually in a context where somebody wants to take advantage of people, that kind of ideas can so easily be weaponized by abusers. But I was also starting to see other ideas that weren't being named as explicitly by victim survivors or by the psychologists. And I think one example of that in the book would be where I'm talking about the hard line that we have between the church and the world, where we have huge suspicion about anything we see as worldly and no kind of discernment whatsoever sometimes, or what calls itself Christian or what says it's of the church. So when we're in a Christian space, we let our guard down, and that even with leaders who are called themselves Christian leaders or in church leaders, we don't do the discernment that we should do, but we can be overly cautious about things that we don't see as explicitly Christian. And that can mean that we don't really think very much sometimes when we're in a Christian space of what we're actually being set up for. What's going to be the outworking of these ideas if we take them to their fulfillment? What's that going to mean for our lives? And so I think part of what I wanted to do was to think about these questions in terms of not just, is this a kind of good doctrine because we accept that it's a kind of orthodox doctrine that Christians have believed for a long time. That's not the conversation I want to have. I want to have the conversation about what's the impact of these beliefs on vulnerable people, particularly in spaces where individuals do want to take advantage of people. And sometimes it's not always the case that a person is actively trying to take advantage. One of the things that I reflected on in writing the book was that sometimes people themselves are formed spiritually and theologically in environments where they're told that this is the only option. And they themselves then preach and expect this of their congregants. So sometimes leaders or people we think have lots of power are also being harmed by the same theologies that they're also using to harm others. So it's not a straightforward picture, but I wanted to think about some of these questions. And of course, in doing this work, which I didn't call the book a kind of womanist account of theology and abuse of power. But I've been preparing for a course that I'm teaching next semester on womanist theology at Edinburgh, and as I've been deep diving into lots of resources, some of which I've never even got to read before, it's been so fun. And part of what it's left me with is a conviction that everything I do is womanist, because actually the very sense of doing the kind of work that is about creating change for the sake of people who are experiencing vulnerability, forms of oppression, is womanist work. Whether or not, and womanism doesn't have to mean we're only thinking about black women. Actually, Africana womanism for me has become a really helpful framework of thinking about community and the well-being of community as part of what the work is that I'm doing. And so when I think about this work on critiquing power, this for me is very much womanist work. And I engage with Dolores Williams and Joanne Marie Terrell in a particular chapter on suffering and sacrifice, because obviously Dolores Williams is the queen of critiquing atonement theories and the ways they can lead to harm. But I think the very task of thinking about how power functions in communities of faith and causes people to experience harm is very much a womanist work, even though I haven't necessarily labelled it womanist in that way in the title. And so for me, writing this book has been really enjoyable also, because it's given me the chance to write about a topic that I feel about very strongly. And I think sometimes I'm interested again in what the other doctors will say about this. The sense of figuring out what to write next can be a real challenge, or what to think about next can be a real challenge. But I really love the fact that each of us are doing the kind of work that we really feel strongly about, that we like to do. And I'm not going to spoil the surprise by talking too much about what the other doctors have been working on. But I love the fact that we're actually doing the kind of work that we feel passionate about and not being pigeonholed into particular topics or themes or kinds of research, because I think that this is partly the joy of having lots more people engaged in this work. I'm going to read a little section for you, just to give you a little bit of a flavour. And I've selected this deliberately for this particular group because this might resonate. And part of what I do in the book is I choose particular case studies, because I think that in talking about these questions, it can be helpful to have an actual example of what I'm talking about. And so I'm going to read a section of where I talk about SPAC Nation and think theologically about the kind of God that SPAC Nation was promoting and had in mind. So this section of the book is called Exploitation in the Name of the Almighty, the Case of SPAC Nation. SPAC Nation, formerly Salvation Proclaimer Ministries Limited, emerged seemingly out of thin air in London in around 2012. It was set up as a charity, then became a private limited company, with the nature of its business including activities of religious organisations. Its stated purpose was to help vulnerable young people and offenders, and this is in part what it became known for initially. The church was predominantly made of young black people and young adults, all led by the Nigerian pastor Toby Adeboyega. His brother Adedapo Adeboyega also had a senior role. The congregation comprised mainly of black young people and notably appealed to young men who had been or were maybe still involved in criminality. Stories circulated about weapons being left at the altar and conversions of young people and many others considered hard to reach. Testimonies emerged about lives transformed. Young men in particular who were marginalised by British society were believed to be finding a spiritual home, but also a network for developing a positive future for themselves. Rumours circulated that young men were leaving gangs and starting businesses and helping fund God's work through their entrepreneurial skills. On the surface, it seemed to be an extraordinary work of God and an answer to what inner city London needed. But the apparent good and even godly work of SPAC Nation acted as a cover for a culture of exploitation and abuse. At first, whispers could be heard about the financial manipulation of young people. This soon became a cacophony in 2019. The Charity Commission launched a statutory inquiry into SPAC Nation, which was announced in December 2019. Nadine White and Emma Yall at the Huffington Post published several key articles after investigating the stories themselves. They uncovered a culture of no accountability for leaders, in which rogue pastors could rise to prominence and exploit young people. This included financial exploitation, including coercing people to sell blood and give the payment to the church, nicknamed Bleeding for Seed. There was also at least one case of alleged sexual assault in a house set up by leaders at the church for young people to live in. One of the most well-known leaders at SPAC Nation was Miriam Bula, and a BBC Three documentary was made about her career as a scam artist. She was appointed as a leader over some of the housing projects, despite her many years of experience in fraud, for which she has been convicted in Belgium, Spain and the UK. In one now infamous video, Vic Santoro, a UK rapper, took to Instagram to share a story of his little brother being coerced into giving his personal financial details to pastors. According to Santoro, Toby and two other pastors met with his brother to assure him all was well and proceeded to register a business at his mum's house where his brother lived. The pastors then set up a business account and withdrew the full £2,000 overdraft, leaving the debt in his little brother's name. BBC Panorama created a special episode about SPAC Nation entitled Conned by My Church, which first aired on 16th of December 2019. A Met Police investigation was launched, but no charges were filed against the church, only individuals, and the investigation was then dropped in 2020. The BBC reported that the organisation was wound up by the High Court in 2012 due to suspicious and incorrect accounts. In the case of SPAC Nation, we find a culture of abuse, developed in large part due to the love of money that had taken over the organisation's architects. The church had no building, instead meeting in luxury hotels around London. Pastors dressed in designer clothes, wore Rolex watches and drove fancy cars. They sought to present an image of economic power and success to young people in the inner city, many of whom were vulnerable and lived with financial need. They used wealth to groom young people, recruiting them in their usual hangout spots and giving them phones and watches before exploiting them for financial gain. To put this in more explicitly theological terms, SPAC Nation, if they believed in God at all, believed in a God who was almighty and required them to be almighty in the lives of the young people they exploited. They promised them a God who could give them unlimited wealth, and they sought to embody this. They projected a God who had the power to house or unhouse them, to place them in luxury and even to bring them to a meeting at the Prime Minister's office. This God demanded everything from those who had little. Almightiness here represented the end of possibilities for so many of the young people left in the wake of this predatory organisation. Now, I've had people who have said to me, it's really brave that you would talk about particular cases. And the reason why I do is because I care very much about people and young people especially. And I often am grateful that as a younger person myself, I had parents and family who could help me to be wary of predatory pastors and individuals. And I do feel a sense of responsibility in ensuring that we pass this forward to younger generations. I will say a little bit now, finally, about the writing process, which for me was really enjoyable. And this book was really born from the urgent stories that I've seen in the news, that many of us have seen in the news, but also from thinking about my own teaching, my own reading, and the kind of questions that I wanted to explore. And so I think about all of these cases, but I begin by trying to define power theologically. And for me, scripture continues to be intellectually really life-giving and something that I think through and it helps me to reimagine the problems that I'm encountering in the world and also in my writing. And as somebody who's coming out of a Pentecostal tradition, pneumatology is also doctrinally always quite important for me. And so that plays a really important role in the way that I approach trying to talk about power as breath in the first chapter of the book. Which I think offers us a way of thinking about power as divinely given and something that we all share in common, even if in the reality of our social and political life, those powers can be distorted and twisted in ways that are really violent. But writing for me is that process of thinking through with other people who are either living or passed on now these important questions and producing the kind of resources that might serve those of us who are navigating these big questions in our lived experiences. So thank you very much, and I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Selina. It's wonderful to hear from you. And as I said at the beginning, the book links are now in the chat. So next we will hear from Dr. Elisa Louis. Elisa, are you there?
Evening, everyone. Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much, Selina. Look forward to talking in a few minutes. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen because I need it. Okay, I need to get from dot to dot. Let me make sure y'all can see it. Can you guys see? Cool. All right. So I'm going to be talking about my book, which is Black, British and Dechurched, Message to the Mainstream. It is a book written to the church. The book was an ethnographic work looking at why some Black people were leaving their churches, whether they were Black churches that consider themselves multicultural, or white majority churches, why they were leaving and finding alternative Bible reading religious spaces. So they tell you in this book why they did, and then it's for the mainstream to kind of look at the gaps as well. And so just to set the tone of the book, many people in the world believe that God is real, but that is the tone of the book. This is not a group of people that I worked with that was skeptical about God. They were skeptical about people. For them, God, mysterious things, gods, even them being gods, for them was a very real thing. And so it's just good to know sometimes what the tone and the paradigm of any text is, especially when it's ethnographic, the type of people that you're listening to as you read. For them, this is not a question. Okay, some people leave the church because they become disillusioned with the idea of God, but that is not this people. They are looking for a religious space that will reveal to them who God is, or who the gods are, what the truth is, and an objective truth. So as we go through some of the behind the scenes of how the book was put together, it is also a bit of an exercise for us here today. As well. It will end with a question that I'm throwing back at you all in the spirit of what this event actually is about. So you might start to feel niggles and pulls and slight senses of irritation the longer I talk, but I think it'll be fine once we get to the question at the end. And I hope you guys stay with me. All right. So many people believe that God is real. And I also just want to put a statement out to say that religion is in demand, and so are answers to difficult questions. So even as I do my work, as I wrote the book, it wasn't with the pessimism that religion is disappearing. you know, people challenge theology. And yes, there is a rise in humanism and atheism, but religion, the belief in God, the mysterious, is still highly in demand around the world, despite what we might see in our workplace or in our media or online. In my online, everybody has a different algorithm. It's pure religion, pure conspiracy theories about religion, finding the truth. And it all depends on what you type and what you search for. Sometimes people can honestly feel that religion is just disappearing and becoming a thing of the past. And I'd just like to make a statement and preface this talk, this conversation, with the fact that I don't believe that is true. And answers to difficult questions are in demand. And that is the root of this investigation and the need for this book. And here is the book, Black, British and Dechurched, Message to the Mainstream. So the first, maybe very annoying thing. These are some of the voiced concerns that came out of my initial fieldwork. I met with people, I set up events and invited them to tell me stories about why they left the church, what their issues were. And these were the dominating views, okay? Slavery, colonization, and imperialism, okay? The legacy of that in our church and our Black British church body today, and obviously the wider church body as well in our society. Racism. I mean, these are very kind of just obvious, big, broad topics, but this is how it was. This is how it revealed itself. Religious and cultural cannibalism, which is something I borrowed from Professor Robert Beckford. And I guess it gives the image or the sense that what was before the Black diasporic state is missing for many people. Yes, we have residues of traditional African systems, ideas, concepts, philosophies, and religion in the Caribbean, and the Americas, and obviously some of that's come over to Britain. But by and large, I can trace myself back to Jamaica. And then beyond that, I have no idea who I am or where I come from. And I've got no idea what feeds into the bigger makeup of my life. Domination of European epistemology and theology and religious studies. The silence of racism in church has been a thing that has been a problem for many people as well. Priorities and methods of the church. One second. So priorities and methods of the churches they go to. Some churches, whether they're Black majority or not, because some people assume, have assumptions we'll come to later, but some churches' priorities have not been meeting the needs of the people who want justice, who want to talk, who want to process trauma that is connected to racism, connected to some of the questions that they have about what it means if God, the Christian God, is the true God. How could all of this stuff happen to us? And for many people who have gone to their ministers, it's just not been a priority of the minister to speak about those things. That was a huge thing. And of course, at the moment, ever more so than even 5 years ago, the European conservative liberal extremes have been quite a dynamic feature of the challenge and the Black Christian crisis that I've found. So these are just some of the overarching things here. And of course, in green, what I put, which is not a bad thing, but is a natural thing, is also just theological difference. People came from all types of churches. Anglican, some of the European historical churches, the Pentecostal churches, the free churches. There was difference in doctrine, approach, how they did things. And all of this culminated together in what I could call this Black Christian crisis and the challenges of, can I be in this space? Can I be Black and be a Christian when all of this is going on around me? Can I be an agent in this space? It's hard enough doing politics, my day-to-day, my life-to-life. What about doing Christianity when this is what I'm seeing? These are the questions that I have, and this is what the wall that I'm pushing against. And so this kind of led to the exodus of some of the people that I worked with, interviewed and engaged with, dialogued with about why they left. So that's just to give you some background, okay? Some of you might be thinking that there is something so obvious missing here, okay? Hold the thought. Okay, so the book, it aims to investigate Black, British and dechurched phenomenon critically. Why are some Black and British Christians leaving the church and joining other Bible-based Black religions that have developed within the Caribbean and American diaspora during enslavement, segregation, and the civil rights era? Furthermore, how have these religions, so it's not only that they've left, but what has kept them? Where have they gone to? What religions have they come to? Furthermore, how have those religions continued to be an ongoing influence on the fringes of the Black British Church? So there is two parts. They've left. Why have they left? But also, where have they gone? What's the pull? What's the strength there? What's the influence? We might see them. You might see them. Society might see them as fringe religions, controversial. Are they even still around? But they have been an ongoing influence on the fringes of the Black British Church for all these decades. And this book tries to investigate and look at why. And here they are. The Nation of Islam, Rastafari, the Hebrew Israelites, and also the Holy Coptic Church, which is Christ consciousness. Some people might know it as that as well. Okay, so these are the various groups. Two of these pictures are taken in my hometown in Brixton. They're out on the streets asking for reparations, preaching scriptures all day, coming out in full effect, actively being proactive, being visible, stopping Black people on the streets and saying, do you know the truth of where you come from? Do you know what the Bible is actually saying, what it actually means, who it's actually written for? Okay, this is the work of those groups, and these are the religious groups that are a main feature of the book, Black, British and Dechurched. And so this was the PhD title. You just don't put on a book because it's a mouthful and it's long, but it does help just give a little bit behind the scene, a little bit more detail behind the scenes of what I did in my work, okay, and what makes up all the different facets that make up this work as well. So it's a critical investigation using decolonization and liberation as foundations for understanding, interpreting and engaging conservative Bible reading groups, okay? And conservative Bible reading groups is highlighted there because actually the people that I interviewed had, most of them, if not all, had very conservative views socially and conservative views religiously. We didn't really come up with, people might consider their ideals radical in terms of ethnicity and race, but they were not theologically radical in the sense that they challenged the authority of the text or tried intentionally to balance their experiences with the text. And so they may have claims that they were understanding their experiences through the reading of the text, and though many people would say it's the other way around, what they say for themselves and what I call a conservative approach to text. I'm going to read a little bit about this notion of preservation liberation. It's a conceptual framework I came up with to kind of capture things in tension here. Yes, they may have a conservative approach. Yes, they may that's how they voice it. But what they're doing is actually in great tension with things that are radical and have a great sense of liberation, where some people may question as well. And then again, the consideration of how these religions, either called Black Bible religions or Afro-Asiatic diasporic religions, which just kind of captures the fact that these religions started on this side of the water, but are tracing or claiming a genealogy back to the Afro-Asiatic region, their influence is there. So I hope you're still with me. I'm trying to give you a little bit of background here about the book. And this is just a little video, brain break, of how I promoted the events, just to give you an idea and a flavor of the kind of world that you'll be in when you read this book, hopefully. Okay. Those are the events that I ran over a period of years, inviting people to come down, focus on particular topics that I believe they were interested in. I asked them, what are you interested in knowing and talking about and sharing with me? Why have you left the church? And they want evidence about whether the Bible itself is historically able to be historically validated, Is Christianity a white man's religion? Or what's the true origins of Christianity? Is it a stolen and repackaged religion? Where do we fit in to the story of Scripture? What is the evidence, whether it be archaeological? What is the philosophical, logical reasons for doctrine? Okay, so I mean, there's a thread through all of these. There's something quite empirical about the evidence. There's something quite absolute about the things that they were hoping to achieve at the end. And again, that might be a bugbear here, but we'll get there towards the end. But just to paint a picture of the world, of this book, just so you know what we were talking about. And so I'm going to read a section about the conceptual framework that I used to kind of try and capture all the different concepts that I believe were emerging from the data. Preservation and liberation. I've innovated a conceptual framework that I believe will best capture the concepts that emerged from the data and interpret the inner working of Afro-Asiatic diasporic religions from a religious perspective. Often, the literature emphasizes those religions as a social-political response to the Black lived reality. However, without negating those aspects, this study considers their religious and theological natures as indicators of their appeal to the de-churched. I intend not to separate them from their social-political function, but to provide a necessary balance, since I perceive religion as it pertains to human understanding and connection to God, a higher power or an unknown mystical force, to be underestimated and underemphasized as core to the decolonial inspiration of these Black religious groups. I began by considering the religious nature of Black Bible religions, specifying the genuine relationship to and belief in a divine God and Holy Scriptures, instead of an abstract sense of ultimacy that serves as a coping mechanism. Further, I categorized Afro-Asiatic diasporic religions as new religious movements, acknowledging both their recent emergence in the 19th and 20th centuries and their relation to established religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and their claims to recover more ancient religions. New religious movements are considered indicators of shifts in society upon diverging from established religions and establishing resistance in their teachings. They faithfully capture their relationship with the wider society, which is integral to their religious formation. I then considered Ethiopianism as an historical religious foundation that gave rise to these religions, merging faith, politics, and genealogy. Ethiopianism was a successful framework that allowed oppressed Black peoples to make sense of Black consciousness and their Christian faith. My framework seeks to encapsulate critical concepts developed and tested since the era of Ethiopianism, and perhaps to broaden its reach and scope beyond the symbols of Ethiopia. At the same time, I want to make more direct genealogical assertions about cultural, religious, and ethnic continuity within the Afro-Asiatic region, which perhaps serves the various religions within ADR, within those religions I've chosen, a bit more integrally. I hope that the slightly mechanical terms I rely on, preservation, liberation, a more explicit reminder of how the framing works, and thus how it can help to be applied beyond what those religions and the de-churched are thinking. Another critical concept in this framework is decolonization, which I've defined by reflecting on Fanon's decolonial lens, considering decolonization in national terms, as well as how it applies to other epistemological sites of colonial occupation. And I felt it works well with religions many considered as Black nationalist religions. The final concept, I believe, brings the conceptual framework into balance is the underpinning influence of conservatism. Conceptualized conservatism is understood to speak to the preference for institution, history, and religious authority, which I argue are central features of Afro-Asiatic diasporic religions, the Nation of Islam, Rastafari, Hebrew Israelites, and how they contribute to Black, British, and de-church identity formation. Final words. The final concept, I believe, brings the conceptual framework into balance. Oh, I've read that already. Okay, I'm nearly done. In this way, Afro-Asiatic diasporic religions can create legacies for Black people and remain anchored in ancient ethno-religious communities that are safe spaces for identity formation in the diaspora and globalized world. Together, these concepts form the preservation liberation framework, a concept I put together to hold in tension the intuition to preserve a traditional, genealogical, and religiously Afro-Asiatic Black conservative institution, and yet to liberate Black religion from white supremacy and the residual colonial and discriminatory attitudes. And so, my final sentence, my question to you, is this a womanist work? Let's talk after Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. Interesting question. Perhaps we'll come back to that at the end. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Next is Dr. Victoria Omotoso. Are you ready to share, Victoria?
Yes. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Big thank you to Carol and Anthony for bringing us all together. I'm in such great company. And really looking forward to, some of our discussions that we'll be having later on this evening. So my work looks predominantly at biblical reception. And so as a contextual biblical scholar, I'm particularly interested in how theology isn't static. It doesn't just drop from the sky fully formed, but it's emerging from culture, being shaped by history, language, identity, and experience. And so just as theology is coming out from context, it is also being constantly reshaped by it. So I'm kicking things off with a really simple question that Jesus asks in Mark chapter 8. He says, "But who do you say that I am?" It's quite a simple question, but it can also be a bit of a mind bender because the answer that is given reveals much more about the person than it does about Jesus. So Jesus first prefaces that question by saying, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples, of course, respond to Jesus telling him, "Some people call you John the Baptist, some people call you Elijah, one of the prophets." And these responses were highlighting how people's views were shaped by the voices and the influences that were around them. So I see it as kind of holding up a mirror. Who we say Jesus is says a lot about where we come from, what stories we've heard, and what we believe. And I would assume that most of us here tonight have a pretty fixed mental picture of Jesus. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, whose picture is that? And why does he look like that? And so the images that we get of Jesus are being continuously shaped by culture, race, and all the messy things and complicated stuff that make us human. And as a result, what that means is that no image of Jesus is ever neutral or boring. Every picture is coming from a conversation, sometimes a clash between who we are and who we want him to be. And one of the wildest places this happens is in film. So when people watch Jesus on screen, it's not just about a movie, but they are bringing their own life stories, biases, and questions with them. And so what my book kind of is drawn out from this, it came from really contextual, organic places. I was quite literally having coffee in Covent Garden all the way back in 2016 with a producer, a film producer, who produced the film, The Lumo Project, which I'll get to in a minute. But The Lumo Project is one of the films that I essentially use as a conversation partner with a second film called Son of Man, which is a South African film set in a Xhosa context. So having conversations over coffee in Covent Garden in the summer of 2016 with the producer, and we were talking about what a PhD would look like if we were to discuss Jesus on film. So I took that and ran with it quite essentially, and I do owe him probably another coffee for giving me that kind of first light bulb moment. But in essence, from that, I started thinking more closely, not just about a dialogue between me as the researcher and the films I'm going to be using, but actually thinking a little bit more closely about the audiences that consume them. And so this led me to thinking about cross-cultural biblical film reception. So this research, again, has stemmed from my own positionality, my own kind of historical context from where I find myself. So I am a British-born Nigerian who grew up in South Africa. And so for me, cultural encounters and cross-cultural experiences is very much part of my own lived experiences as a researcher. And so what I did was that I decided to go to audiences in the UK and in South Africa to simply ask themselves, how do you see your Jesus? In addition to these audiences, I also looked at the filmmakers. So like I said, I was using two parallel films, The Son of Man and the Lumo Project, in order to show parallel films, parallel scenes of each of these films and understand from the filmmaker's own point of view as well. Because of course, filmmakers also have their own context and their own biases in terms of thinking about the Jesus that they want to produce as well. And so one of the questions that I was investigating was not just how the filmmaker's own visions are appearing on screen, but actually understanding, are the filmmaker's intentions being met by the audience's perceptions? So often what can happen is that there can be a destabilization of the filmmaker's intentions. And so what this book does is expands on Bible and film studies just beyond filmmakers' intentions, but actually critically engaging with the audience receptions as well. So in the late 2016, there was an important new study on Bible and film published, The Bible in Motion. And in the film's introduction, Rhonda Burnett Bleschke emphasized that the ever-changing landscape of Bible and film, and she described two areas that needed to be improved on. One was that there needs to be more attention given to audience reception, and two, more focus needs to be placed on non-Western experiences of Bible and film. And so by asking simply the question, who do you say that I am? I presented this to these audiences. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to show you two clips of what I showed some of my film during the fieldwork that I did. And these two clips are of the baptism of Jesus. So what I did was I had four major themes I was looking into. One was the fidelity to the text. So of course, understanding to what extent are these films being in relation to the biblical text. Number two was, of course, the ethnicity of Jesus, which is most arguably one of the most contested areas when it comes to film reception in terms of how did Jesus look and how he's being portrayed. Number three was the music in the film, again, something that gets quite overlooked. In The Bible in Motion, it has probably almost 60 chapters, was only not one was dedicated to the music in film. So of course, music is something that's very much overlooked in terms of understanding the tone of the Jesus films. And number four was looking at gender, and more specifically, the female agency that we see in these films, as well as the masculinity of Jesus. So I'm going to play you the first baptism film, which is from the Lumo Project. So the Lumo Project is a four-part series. So in terms of, it takes four feature films from each of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it relays the films verbatim. So there's a complete narration over the top, and you hear the actors kind of mumbling underneath. So it's actually, they focus a lot on universality. So main draw of this film is to say, this is kind of used as an evangelical tool. This is the Bible that is being portrayed for everyone. So I'm going to play you a clip of that. And then I will then play you a clip of the baptism of Son of Man. So just bear with me one moment. The second baptism is Son of Man, which, as a disclaimer, actually reframes the baptism as the Xhosa circumcision ritual. So it's reframing it within this idea that in Xhosa culture, a man is not fully part of his community until he undergoes this particular culture, this particular ritual. So I'll put that on now. So those are the two parallel scenes that I show to audiences and asking them simply the question of which one did you prefer and why? And this is where the research gets very interesting in that looking at how Western and non-Western portrayals of Jesus are being received by both Western and non-Western audiences. I won't give too much away because you'll have to read the book in terms of what happens next. But for most of it, it was very interesting to see that even when I showed it to South African audiences who were Xhosa South Africans, so I showed it to a mixed group of South Africans, Black South Africans, white South Africans, Indian South Africans, and colored South Africans. And I showed it separately to a group of Xhosa people. For the majority of them still prefer the more westernized picture of Jesus. And so this led me to understanding the commercialization and the globalization of the Western Jesus and how that still sits within a subconsciousness of particularly Black Christians in the global South. And so what the book does is actually to understand and uncover the historical implications and the histories that have shaped a lot of the cultural subconscious is what I call it, in terms of understanding why these historical colonial legacies continue to be shown in the image of the white Jesus and what impact that has, not only for audiences, but also for filmmakers as well, and allowing filmmakers themselves to be much more aware of their own cultural biases and when they cast a new Jesus. What's really interesting in that, as I was actually the end of the book, I do talk about that there seems to be a certain resurgence in terms of Bible and film, TV and things like that in terms of the casting of it, which I was very much then actually rebutted by the announcement that came of Mel Gibson's two-part The Resurrection, which is coming in 2027, in which he's cast a Finnish actor actually for that role, who happens to have blonde hair and blue eyes. So perhaps I spoke too soon in terms of the a resurgence that was going on in terms of how Jesus is being portrayed and the implications that has as well for seeing Jesus as someone who's being portrayed as someone who stands on the side of the oppressed. So a lot of I speak in the book about the Black Christology that is being issued in Son of Man. It takes place in a setting that is not so dissimilar to that of a first century Palestine, of a poor brown Black man who is sitting on the margins of empire, and what that means in terms of the images that we are consuming in Bible and film. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for sharing. Thank you to all three of you. And I think I forgot to say congratulations at the beginning. So forgive me for that. Congratulations again for your achievements to have these books out. Now, we're going to have a bit of time for Selina, Elisa, and Victoria to have a bit of a conversation amongst themselves. Well, to us, for us to listen to them dialoguing together. I didn't know whether you wanted to tackle Elisa's question or whether you want to leave that till afterwards, but I thought it was a juicy question to pose, so I'll leave that to you. But did you want to start your conversation? And while they're doing that, then afterwards we'll open it up to the Q&A. So if you want to be putting your questions, any questions in the chats, Anthony will be keeping an eye on that. Okay, so the three doctors, I'll give you the floor.
Thanks, Carol. Can I kick off with a question? I have lots of questions, but I'm going to just choose one for Elisa and about in the kind of, I loved so much of what you said, and we don't have time to talk about all of it, but I wanted to ask a little bit about your experience of doing ethnographic work. And I was wondering about the process of like engaging with people, recruiting participants, and particularly, was there like a conversation or a comment or a person that just changed something majorly for you in your thinking or in the direction of your project?
Yeah, well, the last one might be a hard question. So actually, in terms of participation and engagement, to be honest, it was so easy because people were so hungry and so ignored. Like, I thought it was going to be such a struggle. And our first event, I was like, I don't know if anyone's even going to turn up. You just put it out on Facebook, you declare it's PhD research, but you just invite people to kind of talk. It's topical at the time. And 100 people turned up from all over
Wow,
the UK. And I
that
was
is
like,
amazing.
I don't actually think I can manage that. Because then I just felt like this overwhelming pressure to be like an apologist and have answers and blah, blah, blah. But that is not actually the method of the work. It's not to have the answers, but it was to facilitate, thank goodness. So that, and just that's just to say that getting people engaged was the easiest part because they were desperate. Again, the world of this book and the world of this research is people want to know, is God real? What is the truth? And Christianity that many of them have been brought up in, or they've come to know and love, and now they're feeling like, oh my goodness, actually, this is quite complicated, it's quite complex. And for some of them who are belonging to churches that have been actively complicit and still benefit from the terrorization of our ancestors, like, what am I doing here? And how do I separate that when I'm praying to God, in the beginning of my book? And I should have said this before I asked the question, but I do actually share my experience of how I got to this point, growing up as quite a sheltered Christian and very late in life, kind of realizing, yeah, you're Black and everyone sees you that way. Like, you go to a Bible college and your God and their God seems so different. You read the Bible differently, everything different. And then your friends start saying, I don't know about this white man's religion thing, I'm out. And I'm like, what? That is the devil, come back. That's the origin of the research. But then I realized saying it's the devil was not enough, right? they have questions. Why is no one answering them? So that was the easiest part, getting them in. When I started doing the regular sessions and focusing on topics, it was about 20 people every time, but it was the same people. They were like really committed to it because the ethnographic process, particularly, but my participatory action research is about trying to solve a problem together. And they wanted to solve the problem. They wanted answers. And so that actually was the easy bit. As for people saying things that changed me, I mean, I was definitely kind of an insider and outsider. Their questions were my questions. And I can honestly say that at no point was my faith in God or Jesus and the Bible shaken in that sense. Definitely my relationship with the church and how they've been doing things. Like you've been saying, it's an abuse of power, even just to spoon feed us whatever you choose, instead of answering the questions we're asking. It's mad, right? Don't worry about that. Just pray, or the Holy Spirit, or that's demonic. That's wickedness. I have a question. Either you don't know, find someone who does. Let's read it together. But what did change me? And actually, Anthony asked me this question when I finished my PhD, and I didn't have an answer at the time, and I never forget that I didn't have an answer. It took me a long while. They inspired me even more so, because all the time I'd been a Christian, I never knew how to ask questions of people in power. I would never question them. That's just the teaching. And I just took it like, that's the teaching. That's how it's interpreted. And they came with so many different interpretations, every conspiracy theory known to man. I'm like, this is how we do theology, mate. Like, this is decolonization. Like, let's see what's under the lies. Okay, so that's what changed me. I was inspired forever to never shy away. Why did it take for me to try and get a PhD, and I got one obviously, to really hone in my critical skills? I've just been underdeveloped all that time in a place so rich with diverse theology, diverse approaches to everything we believe in. It's insane. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much.
Yes, yes, yes.
So, do you want to go? Or
You can go ahead.
okay. I've got a question, I guess, for Selina. I'm just curious to know, what would healthy church leadership look like?
The $1,000,000 question.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking a lot about what even happens on a Sunday when what we've been doing. And most, I say we, I don't really go to church on a Sunday morning like I used to, but like for those who really go every week, or like we have a kind of cultural expression of gathering together for worship, which looks how it looks.
Mm.
But I mean, to go back to Elise's point about questioning, like what we're doing and how is power functioning. So I think what happens is that, and this is partly what I'm tackling, is that we developed a structure of church which has hierarchy built into it, like all the time, and we think that that's the only way to have community. And I wonder how we might reimagine gathering in communities of faith where we're exploring what it is to be followers of Jesus, if that's who we are, because not everybody who goes to church is. They might just be looking and see what's going on. But I think we could imagine something better than what exists. And I think that there's definitely spaces for, having preachers, but we should have a lot more conversation. I mean, I've gone to church long enough to know how many times you hear, and I've preached myself, right? You hear a sermon and there's no space for conversation. There's no space for somebody to say, can you explain that a little bit more? Like, you want me to make life decisions based on what you're saying to me, but I'm not getting the chance to ask why you think that means what you told me it means. And that's because the dynamics of power that we built into the dynamics of our gathering, even in how the room is. You all face one direction, look at this person at the front, and it sets up a certain, you are the people who listen, and that is a person who talks. And I wonder how we might reimagine even the space of churches, let alone the governance structures. We have to care for people and avoid the danger, right, of like of abusive people. So I'm not talking about the kind of openness of governance where there's no accountability and everybody's just hanging out and having a great time. That is an easy environment in which people might come in and take advantage. So I'm not arguing for that. But I'm saying, I don't know what the answer is, but I just want us to imagine something different to what there is, because I think it does a lot of harm to some people in the cases that I've been thinking about, but I think on an even more subtle level it can be damaging, even in cases where there isn't like a major psychopath in a church. Just that sense that, and I'm lucky that I grew up in a space where I was encouraged to cultivate my own sense of spirituality and spiritual practice, but I do think that there are ways in which we could do better with that.
Great, thank you.
I've got a question for Victoria. One of the points of convergence that I guess we had in our research was the issue of white Jesus, right? So if you notice in the flyers, there's black Jesus, black everything, because those are the images that these religions put out. They're just like, we have black Jesus. We're making our own images for our own sanity, for and a sense of reclaiming, actually. And so my question to you, just not as a fixed, I don't want to put you in a position to have a final say in that sense, but in terms of one of your kind of thoughts or feelings coming out from, it seems that white Jesus is still quite influential, and knowing that the people who put Jesus out, put the image out, are very powerful. They have a power over people and their theological imagination. Where would you more lean to in terms of solution? Power of this representation to the poor and the underrepresented, power to all, or power to the site of origin?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a very contested space because these images, like I said, they haven't just emerged out of a vacuum. There's a long history from how these images converged and how they were distributed, right? So, colonialism and all of the heaviness that brings in terms of that. So, in terms of, there needs to be definitely a dismantling of the image from the source, because if it starts from somewhere, it needs to end somewhere as well. So I think a lot of it involves, apart from, I mean, we can do all the reclaiming, but at the end of the day, like there's still these kind of systemic structures that are still kind of have become strongholds, quite literally, in terms of the power and the images that they're bringing out. And I know for a lot of the viewers, like the participants that I engaged with in that, it was a lot of it comes from, so for the UK audiences, for example, which a majority of them were actually white British audiences, for them, there was a understanding that actually there needs to be a reshifting of the white Jesus. So I think a lot of it is also just having much more information in terms of the harmful, what's it called, like harmful foundations that this image um has perpetrated. And I think because of there's not enough, I would say not enough information in terms of destabilizing that power structure that needs to be brought down in that sense. And also, I think when we're thinking about, I know for me personally, when I think about Jesus as Black, of course, thinking of the great James Cone, right, in terms of thinking about not necessarily skin color, but actually how he stands on the side of the oppressed. I think that's also something that is not being centered enough, in that if you the more you continuously um align Jesus with this image of whiteness, the less you're taking him out of actual the reality through which he actually needs to be in. So the more you're aligning him with, with power and with you know ethnic superiority, which of course when you pull that thread longer, it just becomes again another aspect where you see things of Christian nationalism and how the savior that is supposed to be aligned with those who are on the margins is now being the same savior that's now being perched on the echelons of power and empire. So there is a lot of dismantling, I think, that needs to be done, quite frankly, at the source of that, of where that image comes from in itself.
Thank you.
Anything else between you that you wanted to bring out?
I guess just for both of you, um, I had it written down because I had like a deep dive. Um, what was the biggest challenge, I think, in terms of whether that's emotionally or spiritually or theologically, um, when you were writing your respective books? Anyone can go. It doesn't.
Should I go for
I think it was trying to write about a topic that is so painful for so many people and not make it worse. Like, I spent so much time going over the language, every phrase, every word, just to make sure that it would be as precise as possible and not do any damage to anyone in the meantime. And that was the most difficult part of it, was just the care for the readers and making sure that I wouldn't do harm to somebody who'd already suffered enough and too much in a religious space. And at the same time, say what I felt I needed to say theologically. It was really hard. And I'm still not satisfied, because I'll never be satisfied until I never will, because there's always something I could improve. And at the point I was doing last edits, and the publisher said, "Oh, well, you can make tiny, small changes now." And I was rewriting sentences. She was like, "This is not what I mean, for the record." But small changes. I said, "As long as you give me the chance, I will make changes. So you just got to take it and just put it out there." But that was the hardest thing.
Yeah. So I think for me, because a lot of what I've written is probably quite London or city centric. When I've written a message to the mainstream, there wasn't enough word count of how you might apply it in various contexts. I think someone who is in a Black majority, a multicultural, or a city church, where they might see Hebrew Israelites on their street corner, they might have actually seen this phenomenon for themselves. They might think, okay, I can actually do something. I'm always about, what are you doing on the Sunday? What's your plan for the year? And what's the 10-year plan to address this issue? What can you change immediately? There just wasn't enough word count, I think, for me. The hardest thing was trying again to find the language to help people apply it into the various contexts. I did my best, but the phenomenon speaks for itself. It has a site, it has a context, but the lessons can apply far and wide. But I just didn't have enough word count, basically. There just wasn't enough. It may require a part two. It definitely requires a couple of church visits and talks of individuals. The lessons can be applied everywhere, but to allow the phenomenon to speak for itself, I had to be true to focusing on the context from which it came.
Yeah.
And so for me, it feels quite city-centered or, London-centered in that sense. But yeah, I think that was a challenge for me. But that's fine because it just always creates more opportunities, doesn't it?
What about you,
And
Victoria?
for you, yeah. What about
I
you?
think for me the most challenging part was actually from the viewers themselves. So actually, I was not anticipating so much of a rebuttal against the Black Jesus when I was showing it to Black people. So for me, I actually had a lot of unlearning to do as well. I know we always say, like, as a, first researching 101, you have to be an objective, researcher, which I mean, I will die on this hill that objectivity is a myth.
Yeah, completely
And so
agree.
and and so I yeah, for me it was just like, oh, okay, so how do we approach this? Like how can we um reconcile a Jesus who saves that is not white for Black people, for Black Christians, particularly. I mean, I was like, well, they're seeing their language being spoken on screen, like they're seeing elements of their culture, and yet there was still this very much a frontal against that kind of portrayal. So I think for me, yeah, there was just a lot of kind of unlearning um of my own biases and actually recognizing my own biases as I was actually collecting all this data and trying to sift through it. And I think one of the things that I do in the book is that I keep all the quotes verbatim. So um, as a researcher, you are also in this place of power where you can, kind of merge. And I was very much aware of the power that I had and actually wanted to actually let go of that power quite a lot and actually just say, this is word for word what viewers have said, and actually be okay with that, even if it wasn't my initial hope for what I thought the project
Yeah,
was going to end up being, and
yeah,
actually just respect the voices. Because if I'm going
yeah.
to say, well, I'm going to let, Global South voices be heard, then I should let Global South voices be
Yes,
heard,
yes.
and keep to that. So I think, yeah, for me, yeah, just coming to terms with that slight disconnect was probably one of the challenging things, but actually accepting it and being like, well, that is how, some Black Christians see that, and actually thinking about, okay, but how do we, like what Elisa was saying, kind of the reclaiming, and so, thinking about the Christ image as not just um as a victor, but also as a liberator, as a healer, as a shepherd. So actually and just getting audiences to also think about Jesus in those terms, in terms of thinking it about Jesus for themselves, not just what has been commercialized um, globally as well. So yeah, I think for me that was probably one of the more challenging things, was actually just accepting the disconnect that occurred. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then we do have a question in the chat, and please do put your questions in if you have anything to ask any of the doctors, or if you want us to ask a specific author about a specific thing, or you can address it to all three authors. But I wanted to revisit Elisa's question. Does anyone have a thought?
What do you think, Elisa? Do you think your work is womanist work?
If it is, I think it's quite bad womanist work. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, like, so I did a talk a couple of weeks ago, and they were like, so where's the bridge to womanism? And I was a bit like, oh, well, if you read this chapter, I do talk about it. So I do address um, the method in relation to the issue. But in terms of, I don't feel like my work satisfies all the categories simply because the phenomenon had to speak for itself and the people didn't. Gender came up once, for one, in its most basic form. What they wanted to speak about, it just wasn't the feature. There were as much men as there were women. Yes, I could I could have dissected the whole interactions in a womanist framework, but in terms of their needs, their questions, their voices, they don't tick enough of the boxes for the work itself to be considered that way.
It's
And
interesting.
I think that also I'm not sure that I am a womanist. I'm just not naturally radical enough, to be honest. It's not my nature to be radical in that way. And my Christian expression, I don't think is particularly radical enough to be considered womanist. It's not subjective enough in that sense. I mean, it probably is in real life, but not in my head, not what I imagine. Just to caveat that, because objectivity is not a real thing. I know that. But in my own personality and actually in the expression of my faith, I think fixed truths are very important to seek. How we express them are always going to be imperfect and they will be subjective. And so I don't think I tick enough of the boxes. But some people think I do.
Because I think go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, but also because the work comes from my experience and I broaden the crisis that I had into a scientific people research. I don't know if broadening it took that away, but one of the feedback I have had is that I made a very clear decision to bracket myself. Here is who I am. This is where I came from. This is what I'm about. And this is how I see the world. Okay. And I'm letting the audience know that so that if that infringes too much on my interpretation, you can cuss me. Okay. Because actually I want it to be, as much as I can, the voice of the people I'm speaking about. I didn't center myself in the research. And actually a feedback from people who are womanists is that I should have so centered myself in the work. And so based on those things, I don't know, I don't think so, but womanism, I guess, cannot be fixed in terms of how it's expressed. Okay, sometimes it's about who you read and what womanism is. So that's why I put it out there to see what you think.
And I think, I feel like womanism is flexible enough. And I've been reading Lady Phillips, who does a series of books on womanism, and kind of her thinking of it as like this evolving movement that's almost borderless. And not in a way that white men can co-opt it and do what they want with it, but borderless in the sense of like, if you are doing the kind of work, and of course, can black men be womanist is the ongoing thing, but like if you're doing the kind of work that is paying attention to the multiplicity of the ways in which power functions in relation to our bodies, race, gender, class, sexuality, disability, whatever you want to throw in the mix, right? You're doing womanist work if you're critiquing with those lenses, and if change is on your mind and this is not just some intellectual project but about actual community life, I think it can be. My question was going to be about where the women were in the work, in terms of when I think about these Bible-based religions, they terrify me on a gender point, because I'm like, what's celebrated as liberation is liberation for some people, but it's not liberation for me. And so it's like on a race level, yes, we might be liberating black communities from a kind of white colonial Christianity, but where is the place of black women in the imaginary of some of the black men who are leading and cultivating these traditions and recruiting people? And I say that for people I know who've converted, and I'm like, if this is the liberation that you think is black, I don't know if I want that liberation, thanks, as a black woman. It doesn't look very free for me. And that's what I feel would for me be the womanist angle, would be, where's the gender critique of these traditions that are claiming to be liberative, and who is missing out of that image of liberation?
Yeah. And in no way the conversations that came up, they were not intersectional.
Which itself is telling, right?
It is. But I have testimonies of people who have come under these religions, gone into what we would have used to call, we would have called maybe 10 years ago, like a conventional kind of family setup, or those ideas, and they feel they're genuinely thriving. And so they do feel a sense of liberation. Their
Yeah, yeah,
life,
yeah,
they
yeah,
would say,
yeah.
is absolutely much better. Things make a lot more sense of them. That things make a lot more sense for them.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm just like, well, if you say
And
that
there's
you
room
are,
for that too, right? There's room for that
well, this is
too.
what I'm asking. Is there?
And
Yeah.
that is what I think is like. So
Yeah.
I think in a kind of Africana womanist tradition,
Yeah.
the center is not the individual woman; it's the family, right?
Yes.
So like,
Definitely.
if the goal is the liberation of of black families and black communities, then that doesn't necessarily have to look like how Western notions of feminism determine
Yes.
gender has to look, and black women can find freedom outside of those norms. So I think, but that's what I would love
Mm.
to
Me
go back
too.
and ask them about that.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
say I can? No, no.
Well, it's a weekend. It can
Oh
be
yeah, yeah,
done.
yeah, yeah,
It
yeah,
can
yeah.
be done. I mean, like I said, for to keep be integral to the work, it just wasn't the concern.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so it's when it comes up and people are just like, come on, black woman, why isn't this agendaed? Why they demand it from
Mm,
me? I'm just like, they didn't demand it from me, and they didn't demand it from their questioning, because it was actually in they're like systematically theologizing things. Like, this is, the methods are just in a different space altogether.
mm.
So it was interesting. I mean, that's what makes the phenomenon interesting, is
Wow.
this kind of pro-black conservative space in 2025.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It really is.
Hmm.
I mean, I just also wonder in terms of like if we're thinking about womanism, which of course starts from, a black woman's embodied experience of God and spirituality and community and all the things involved in that. To what extent can we say that, well, what if that black woman's experiences um, does not necessarily include a gendering of what liberation looks like?
Yeah, I think that's what I think it kind of came out of it, even though I didn't
Yeah.
have the space. And that's almost what it appeared to be.
Mm,
Like, and in this day and age, you can't get away from being intersectional. It is the baseline. But
yeah.
actually speaking to this group of people, they were like, it came up once,
Yeah.
because there are some teachings about the divine feminine that
Mm,
might come up. Those are
Mm.
interesting, but people didn't really seem to bite on that.
yeah.
It was so quite general, and actually just
Yeah.
uncovering lies and
Yeah.
anyway, I won't hold the
Like
space.
yeah, no, it's an interesting point because I think I guess it's a difference between, it's like if you were interviewed as a group of black people from a particular, from my grandparents' generation,
Yeah.
they may not articulate to me a race problem, right? Like they would, my grandparents personally would, but there would be people in my grandparents' generation who, if you sat them down and talked about their lived experience, they may not name race.
Mm,
They may name other things in terms of their experiences of the world, but that doesn't mean they're not living a racialized experience
yeah.
because they don't articulate it right. And I
That's
think with
right.
gender as well, it can be so normalized, especially if these are people who like have been in black churches. It's so normalized that if you ask them what's the thing that bothers you as oppression, they
Yeah.
can't even name it as a thing. It's just the norm, right? So they don't even know there's an option
Yeah.
apart from what they're living. So the thing that's obvious is a race. So that's what comes forward. And it's
Mhm.
that tension of like how, as a person analyzing the data,
Yes.
as you say, to not like superimpose yourself on the data, but at the same time, because of your training, you bring expertise to the analysis
Yes.
that
Yes.
your average black woman who's busy raising her kids, doing her shopping, she ain't got time to think about intersectionality. She's just trying to survive. She's living it. She's living it every day, but she's not trying to put words to it. So I think it's
Mhm.
partly how, and it is a tension of how you kind of do that analysis
Yeah.
when it's not coming through, but in the data from what people are saying about their experiences.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yes.
I think that's always going to be a challenge, like as a researcher, because like you said, Selena, like there's so much of what you don't want to impose on, but there's so much that you still just notice just because you're trained to pick out things like that. So I remember even when I was doing my research, I used grounded theory, right? So thinking about how what themes were emerging. And
Yes.
even though, like you said, they won't they're not in the space to be able to articulate what these means, but actually you'd be like, oh, wait a minute, why, where is the source of this kind of power line coming from? And then you start to pick apart things. But I think if you're going to articulate that, it's very important to almost separate your findings from the actual data that's coming from the lived
Yes.
experiences of these people, so as to not not undermine
Yes.
what
Yes.
what they're feeling, because again,
Yeah.
their experience is absolutely valid.
Yes. Yes.
And so to kind of say this is what they think, but actually this is
They
what
should have thought this.
this is what they should have actually thought. Actually, that
Yeah. Yeah.
completely, it completely, almost humanizes their voice in that way. So
Yeah.
actually, I think there's a very fine line between saying this is the lived experiences of these people and also add a reflection of actually,
Mm.
these are things from, the historical academy training and things that we can observe,
Hmm.
that where this is stemming from.
Yeah, for sure.
Really important
Hmm.
to just always be like mindful of that.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
Thank you, doctors. That was a really good discussion. So thank you to Victoria, Selina, and Elisa. Thank you for taking the time to come and share your insight with us. Thank you to everybody who's attended. It's been great to see everybody and to have the support for this event. As I said, the book links are in the chat, and also Anthony's put in where the video will be shown once we've edited and uploaded it. So thank you everyone for coming. And once again, I want to give congratulations to the three doctors here and wish you all the best with whatever work you're doing next. Just glad to see you thriving. And I hope that those of you in the audience, sounds funny saying audience, but I don't know what else to call you. Just hope that everyone in the audience who is perhaps thinking about taking a journey into theological research or who's doing it at the moment takes encouragement from this event and seeing what these three doctors are doing in this space. Yeah, that's all I want to say, but just thank you everyone for coming and taking the time out tonight. It's been great seeing you all and hearing from you.
Thank you, Carol, for hosting us.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, everyone.